Hello, everyone. Welcome to a wonderful plenary session that I have the great honor to introduce. My name is Ken Goldberg. I'm from UC Berkeley. My qualifications for being the introducer are first that I am an enormous fan of our speaker today, and we share something in common because we were both born in Nigeria. Now, I have watched our speaker's career over the last few years, and I have to say she is inspiring and magnificent. And it's going to be a real treat to hear what she has to say today. She has a fascinating history. She was born in Nigeria, in a small town north of Ibadan, where her parents were both university professors and architects. She then moved to Ghana, went to high school there, and then was accepted at Dartmouth University, where she studied computer science. Then she moved to Carnegie Mellon and did her PhD there with Bernardine Diaz, Tony Stentz, and other advisors. She did her work on algorithms for coordinating multi-robot teams for scheduling and control. She took a position at Ashesi University, a phenomenal university that is spearheading a whole new approach to education in Ghana. And she is heading the robotics program and the computer science program. She came there with enormous energy, has revamped the curriculum. I had the pleasure to visit her there and saw her in action. It's an absolutely spectacular university, brand new. And she's been working now on robots for a variety of different applications, including road inspection, developing algorithms for, which is, if you've been to Ghana, you may know that the roads are a bit of an issue. So she's working on how to improve that. She's also looking at education and developing countries around all of Africa, and she'll tell you a little bit about her work there. She has been a recipient of a number of awards. She's spoken at TED Global. She was awarded last year the Tribeca Disruptive Innovation Award. She's traveled all over the world, and she has most recently been appointed the chair of the Computer Science and Robotics program at Ashesi. So please join me in welcoming the wonderful Ayorkor Korsah.
Thank you very much, Ken. It's really an honor to be invited to give this talk at ICRA. This is not going to be your typical ICRA technical talk, and in fact, I'm going to start off with a personal story. Ken has already helped me with part of the story, so thank you. But as Ken mentioned, I was born in Nigeria, grew up in Nigeria and Ghana, which are both in West Africa. And like any child growing up, had dreams, aspirations, things I wanted to do, things I wanted to be. And my parents always emphasized the importance of education. And I was very inspired by a particular quotation which likened a human being to a mine of gems, and education as the key to that mine. And this was an appropriate analogy for someone growing up on a continent which is really known for its natural resources. So, growing up, I loved books, I loved science, I loved learning. And the more I studied science, the more it just made sense to me. I loved the fact that it explained the things in the world around me. However, a slight challenge we have in our educational system in both Ghana and Nigeria is that it tends to be very theoretical. Lots of information from books, but you don't get to actually do much. And so although I was fascinated by technology, it wasn't until I went to university at Dartmouth that I really experienced what it was like to help create technology. I remember the first computer science class I took, I just found it completely fascinating that I could actually program the computer and make it do what I wanted to do and not whatever it was meant to do, or whatever it was sitting there doing on the desk. And I found that very, very empowering, and it was an experience I hadn't had the opportunity of having throughout my education leading to that point. And this feeling of empowerment and excitement just continued as I learned more about engineering, learned how to design and create digital systems. When I discovered robotics, that was just like pure heaven, because it was a combination of two things that I had grown to love very much, computer science and engineering. And then to make it even better, I felt powerful when I was programming a computer that was sitting at a desk. So imagine programming something that's actually moving around and interacting with the physical world. It was absolutely incredible. And so that's how I ended up in graduate school at Carnegie Mellon studying robotics. And there I had the opportunity to apply my background in computer science to designing algorithms for long-range navigation and multi-robot coordination. However, even as I discovered these new loves, including robotics, I never really forgot my original loves for education and for Africa, which is where I'm from, and it really means a lot to me. And so in the middle of my PhD program, I persuaded my PhD advisor, who's absolutely awesome, that we needed to design a robotics course for a university back home in Ghana. And she helped me with that, and she actually came back to Ghana with me to help me get started in teaching that course. So this course at Ashesi University in Ghana was, as far as we know, the first robotics course to be taught in Ghana. And part of the reason why I wanted to do it is, having taught at Ashesi before and having interacted with computer science students there, I felt that they did not have a broad enough conception of what they could do with this amazing field of computer science. Many of the students had aspirations of, I'm going to graduate, I'm going to work at a software company, and maybe I'm going to create accounting systems or human resource management systems. And to me, that just sounded so boring, because I knew there was so much more you could do. And so that was really my subversive aim with this robotics course, to really help the students expand the notion of what computer science is capable of, and more broadly, engineering and related fields, to basically help them catch the same bug that I had caught as a student in engineering, computer science, and robotics. So the course was incredibly successful and a learning experience for all involved, both myself, my supervisor, my students. And it was extreme. We all know how challenging and frustrating robotics can be sometimes. You spend hours and hours trying to make something work, so it was a huge challenge for the students. They had never done anything like that before. But at the end of the day, it was really, really fulfilling. And for me, the best part of it was on the final day after our poster session, one student came up to me and said, "You know what, I was always so scared when I had to do anything to do with developing technology, but now I have the confidence that I can actually do it." And to me, that was the most important outcome of doing this. So, it was a small group of students. They all went on and did different things. One of them actually loved robotics so much that he went outside the country and did a master's in robotics, but the rest of them all went into software development. A couple of them actually started a startup, and they originally planned to do smart traffic lights, intelligent traffic lights for Accra. It didn't really pan out that way. They ended up pivoting to something else. But interestingly enough, just a few weeks ago, that company was named the Software Company of the Year in Ghana. Now, 5 years after teaching that very first course, I had an opportunity to talk with some of the students, and I asked them, okay, when the course first ended, you all had great feedback on how important it was, how impactful it was. Now, 5 years later, what do you think? I mean, none of you ended up in robotics. You're all doing different things. Do you think it was still important to you? And they all said that it was incredibly important to them in terms of shaping their future paths. And some of the things they said included things like, it just helped them be more creative. It gave them a vision of what was possible. It inspired them to, start a company, even though they ended up not doing automation. The hands-on experience was good. And, people often ask me, what do you think is the sort of the killer application of robotics in Africa? And I'm not afraid of saying, I really don't know. I have a few ideas, but to me, it's captured very much by one of the students who participated in this first course when he said, just the exposure is important, and with time, the applications in the African context will emerge. But what we just need is students to have that exposure and to have these skills. So fast forward a few years, after finishing my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, I returned to Ghana to Ashesi University, as Ken mentioned. And when Ken visited Ashesi, we were talking about our shared backgrounds and some of the promises and challenges of doing robotics in Africa. And at the time, I had begun to hear about other things that were going on in Ghana and in other African countries. And so we thought it would be a great idea to start a network, to establish a network, the African Robotics Network, as a way of bringing together people on different parts of the continent who were engaged in or interested in robotics in Africa. And so Ken and I started AFRON in 2012, mostly as an online community to find out who was out there and to promote, get some communication going. So AFRON is open to anyone, anywhere in the world who is either engaged in or interested in robotics in Africa. So that includes African roboticists who are working in the US or in Europe or in other countries. And at the moment, they are actually, I think, over 400 individuals and a number of institutions who are all part of this network in various parts of the world. One of the advantages of this is that it's put us in touch with other people with similar interests and given an opportunity to learn more about what is actually going on in different parts of the continent. So, since we're talking about robotics in education in Africa, this illustration basically shows a little bit about what the state of robotics education is in a number of countries in Africa. I will say it is a work in progress. It's not comprehensive, and there's probably some work that I've missed. But we sort of have three categories of countries. So in places like Ghana and Nigeria, we're really very much at the beginning of the process, in the sense that there's lots going on in terms of outreach and activities for students in primary school and secondary school to get them excited about STEM. There's some isolated robotics courses for undergraduates. But there's not much of an industry, and there are no majors or graduate programs in robotics, and very little research going on in robotics. Now, in a place like Kenya, you have universities that actually have mechatronics programs. You have institutions that are doing a lot in terms of technology incubation and promoting sort of the hacker and maker community. And you also have kind of the beginnings of companies that are related to robotics, so not necessarily doing robotics as their core business, but are doing things related to sensors and electronics and things that are very much related to robotics. And then you have countries like Egypt and South Africa, which are much further along in the process, in the sense that you actually have graduate programs and research conferences and companies that are a little bit further along in terms of robotics-related technologies. But in nowhere in Africa do we have the kind of industry that exists in places like the US and Europe. But the ecosystem is building, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as we go forward. So I'll just give a brief description of some of the things that are going on. So at Ashesi, where I am, we're still teaching this robotics course for undergraduates. It's part of the computer science major. We don't have a robotics major, and most of these students still end up going into software engineering or related fields. But a few of them get really excited and get engaged in small research projects at the university. Now, one thing that is still important to us is kind of building the pipeline and giving students in high school the kinds of opportunities that I didn't have, and even many of my students didn't have. And so we do a lot of training of our university students to serve as mentors for the program we run for high school students. And every summer, for a couple of weeks, we have about 60 high school students from all over the country who come to Ashesi and engage in robotics and various other activities. Now, we integrate this tightly with our core curriculum and our core approach to education at Ashesi. So it's not just about robotics, not just about technology, but it's about leadership and ethics and design thinking. And we believe that this is important because you don't want to foster people who are only technologists, but people who have a sense of responsibility for the community and actually want to think through what they're going to use their skills for. And it seems that this is working because, when we asked high school students in an open-ended question, so what did you learn? What are you taking away from this? Of course, they talk about robotics and programming, but they also talk about personal growth and teamwork and critical thinking and leadership and public speaking. And this feeling of empowerment to me was summed up very aptly by one of the students who basically said that, I think this program will create people who in the long run are going to contribute to the development of their country and also the world. So they're thinking beyond themselves and actually thinking about what they can do with the skills and excitements that they're building. Now, there's another important player in Ghana is the Ghana Robotics Academy Foundation, which it was established a couple of years ago by, he's actually a Ghanaian roboticist who works at NASA, but also is really passionate about using robotics to inspire students in STEM-related fields. And so through this organization, several robotics clubs, actually I think hundreds of robotics clubs have been established in schools throughout the country, and they organize competitions and also facilitate participation in international competitions like the World Robotics Olympiad. Now, in a similar way, similar things are going on in Nigeria, where an organization there also organizes similar programs for high school, middle school, and primary school students throughout the country and gets them to participate in international competitions. As I mentioned earlier, Kenya is a little bit further advanced in terms of the hacker community and the sort of the general technology development ecosystem. And an important player in that space is iHub, which is an innovation hub for the tech community around Nairobi. So they serve both as a hacker space, a technology incubator. They run programs for students. They collaborate a lot with university students from a nearby university. And one of my favorite, they have lots of important things coming out of iHub, but one thing that always makes me smile is this little robot made out of a mouse, an old computer mouse. It's called the Panya Bot, and they basically teach young kids how to convert a mouse into a robot and how to program it. So it's a really exciting program. As I mentioned earlier, Egypt is actually doing really amazing things in terms of robotics. And I recently learned that the ICRA, the Robotics and Automation Society there, was named the RAS chapter of the year, I think this year. So they do a lot in terms of education. So their undergraduate programs, their graduate programs for robotics and mechatronics. They have research conferences. But what the RAS chapter there is really trying to do now is to build an ecosystem, bring the different players together in the country and collaborate with a local organization that does technology incubation to try and take the excitement that young students get from participating in these conversations and create a pipeline for them through educational programs and ultimately to the point where they might want to have a startup company. So it's pretty exciting. So, whenever there's anything exciting going on, there are always challenges, and challenges always, the other side of a challenge is an opportunity. So one of the biggest challenges I see, especially in Ghana and West Africa, is a significant disconnect between people who work with their hands and people who work with their heads. So you have lots of very creative technicians, people who've taught themselves how to assemble and fix electronic gadgets, but don't necessarily have the formal education backing that to understand the scientific principles behind what they're doing. And then on the other hand, you have people who've gone to university, but because the educational system is so theoretical, they really can't do anything with their hands and can't build anything. And so that's where I think, the efforts that are going on to kind of build more of a maker community in many of these countries is really important, both to bring both these two communities together and to fill the gaps in skills where they exist. Another challenge and opportunity that I see is that, in general, the demand for these robotics education programs far exceeds the supply. The number of people that are available to run these programs, who have the skills to run these programs and who have the time to run these programs. And that then brings us to, the issues of time and funding, which are, you always have to come up with creative ways of funding these programs because, in a country like Ghana, we really don't have a national research fund, which is very sad, but we won't talk about politics here. And then on the flip side, international organizations tend to be interested in funding things like, well, people need food, and people need medicine, and people need to learn how to read, and don't seem to be as interested in funding things like technology and innovation. So you always have to be creative in finding funding. And then the last thing that's just specifically related to these education programs is the need for a very several capable, robust, low-cost robotic platforms. And it was this need that led led AFRON to launch a couple of years ago what we called the $10 Robot Challenge, where we challenged robot designers all over the world to try and design a robot for education that would cost on the order of $10. And lots of interesting designs came in. If you'd like to learn more about that, you should come to the Developing Countries Forum tomorrow. So that's my shameless plug. This is all I'm going to say about that. So in conclusion, what I see is that in Africa, just like in anywhere else in the world, robotics is a very powerful tool for teaching a broad set of knowledge and skills to students of all ages, from kids all the way to students in the university. And the key goal is really empowering this young generation of smart students to create technological solutions to problems that are relevant to their communities and to other parts of the world. And I think this is really, really important, really important, and a paradigm shift in terms of the way many people are used to viewing Africa. It's wonderful to have lots of people around the world, trying to create solutions for problems in Africa, but how much more effective would it be if we empower young, bright people in Africa to create solutions for their own problems? And so that's the challenge I'm throwing out to everyone, really. How can we empower students in Africa to join the ranks of technology creators so that they can solve their own problems? Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ayorkor. We have time for some questions. Please.
Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I have a question. You said you have creative ways of finding funding, where do you actually find it? Do you get it from external organizations, or where do you actually find your funding? You said you have creative ways of doing it. Do you sell your research as being helpful for food, or do you, what do you do?
Well, so I said we need to find creative ways. So for the programs at Ashesi, for example, for the programs we do with high school students, for the first couple of years, we were dependent on a grant we had, which was actually a carving off of a scholarship grant, but we used it for, it was basically labeled as the recruitment part, or it is, the recruitment part of that scholarship grant as a way of getting talented high school students into the university. But we had to transition from that model to kind of a financial aid model where some students who can afford to pay for it, and then the majority of the students who can't afford to are then subsidized by those who can. So that's for the high school program. I know others who run similar programs. They try and get various companies as part of their corporate social responsibility to fund aspects of this, but it means you're constantly in that cycle of just trying to find funding. And many companies prefer to give in kind rather than in cash, but you really do need cash for some things, So I think we need to continue to find creative ways. I don't really have an answer to that, so it's still. And the other side of this is, finding creative ways to fund the research, because the research is also. You want to get more undergraduate students involved in research, but. In countries like South Africa and Egypt, where governments are a little bit more forward-looking in that respect, they have research grants, but in places like Ghana, you have nothing like the NSF or anything like that. So it's, it's a work in progress.
Question? I'll ask one on the way over there. Ayorkor, can you, can people here join Afron? Can we, what is the URL to go
It's
there?
robotics-africa.org.
Great. And that's open to anyone in the world can be a member.
Yes, everyone in the
I also want to ask you just briefly to follow up on that question. There's a misconception, I think, that in some way that Africa needs this help from the West. And I think what's so interesting in my experience and what you're describing is that, but there are these unique skills that Africa can actually teach us in the West about how to repurpose, how to refashion, how to work with materials, limited materials. I think that the Lollybot and some of the designs we saw were so innovative because they were using materials that were often discarded, and essentially taking things that I think from other parts of the world would go out and buy components. They were very smart to look into recycling, reusing components that would otherwise be in landfills, and then repurposing them. And I think that set of skills is actually lacking in the developed world. Is that your impression?
I think it's also. That thing goes back to. The disconnect I spoke about earlier, in that, so if you go to Ghana, there's a community of people who are really good at this, but if you go to any formal educational institution, you'll probably find no one who's really good at this. So the idea of bringing those two communities together to learn from each other, I think, is really important.
Thank you for your great talk. You did a lot of work. The question I have is, sorry for my ignorance, could you explain a little bit about the infrastructure in Ghana, what materials you have access to, in terms of how familiar people are with new technologies, because that's something that I personally am not very familiar with. And also, could you explain where you started doing this, where you started, how long it took to do all this work, and so on.
Okay. So about the question of infrastructure, or technology. So with respect to technology, what's the word, a benchmark that people often use is mobile phones. So in Ghana, almost everyone has a mobile phone. And that's, both rural and urban. Many urban young people might even have smartphones, but, not necessarily. Now, in terms of infrastructure, like physical infrastructure, you definitely have a huge variety, and I kind of have this picture here where, on the top left, you have Accra, which is the capital of Ghana, the biggest city, and then, right below that, you have a village in the north of Ghana, and, so people have there's a huge diversity in the way people live and the kinds of resources they have access to. So the bottom two pictures are two schools. The one in the middle is one of the best public high schools in the country. The one to the far right is the local primary school in the village near the university where I work. And the kinds of resources that these two schools have access to are very different. So like anywhere else in the world, you have huge contrasts within the country. Does that answer your question? Oh, and where we started. So we basically started with Lego, just because. So I'm a computer scientist. I'm not a mechanical engineer, so it's much easier for me to program things than to design hardware and build it from scratch. So for us, it was easiest to use kits that already exist and then focus on the programming of it. Yeah.
Okay, so my question, thank you first for the wonderful talk and all the wonderful activity in this area. What do you think the best way is for our research community in the US or to sort of be involved? And are there any programs in place like research exchanges for grad students or something like that? And if not, can we start them?
So formal exchanges, at least with, how do I put it? There might be exchanges with particular universities that I'm not aware of, but I can definitely say that I don't know of any university who would not want someone to come over and help out. That's one of the places where then we have to get a bit creative about funding. It's easy. I know, for example, with my university, we love to have visiting people, and we get a lot of visiting people, but if they're not Fulbright, so if they're faculty, they can come through the Fulbright program. Otherwise, they often have to be self-funding or to raise funds to come over. So I think there are a variety of ways for people to get involved. And one of the ideas of AFRON was by promoting this communication, you get a better sense of what's going on in different places and perhaps the kind of needs that might exist in different places, and then that might help in making connections. Because I think, I was talking to a colleague in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, and they have a pretty strong research collaboration with a university in Germany, for example. That's, their particular university. And I think such research collaborations are really important for a number of reasons. One is that often it's easier to get published if you're doing it in collaboration with an institution that is a little bit more established, has a little bit more experience. So on that level of things, those kinds of collaborations are very important.
I would just add, it's one first step is to join AFRON and go to robotics-africa.org and sign up. And then we'll start an email thread for anyone interested in next steps in collaboration in this area, and we welcome your interest and participation. I have to say, sitting here, I'm thinking that in some way there's going to be a stage. We've watched this amazing transformation in China over the last decade. I think the next major transformation is we're gonna see this in Africa. And we're going to be at ICRA, Africa will be in, I'm gonna predict in the next 15 years. And when we look back on all of this, one of the real pioneers and leaders in this field is Ayorkor. And so we're such a pleasure to have you here today. Thank you.
Ken is